We were on a training exercise in the army, and we set up camp for the night far from any town or road. The trees were dense around us, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant animal call. The day had been spent moving heavy packs and equipment, and by the time we set up our tents, I was exhausted. We ate quickly using our headlamps to see what we were doing, and then crawled into our sleeping bags. Only the feeble light from our flashlights and the faint glow from our bonfire could illuminate the pitch-black woodland where I was sleeping in my tent. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that was creeping in by staring up at the fabric above me. I thought it was just my tiredness, so I tried to sleep. When I woke up, I heard a strange noise, a low, steady thumping that sounded like something heavy hitting the ground repeatedly. I listened carefully to try to figure out what it was, but it was too heavy to be human footsteps. I sat up and quietly unzipped the tent, peeking out into the darkness. My gut told me to stay put, but something else, perhaps curiosity or a sense of duty, pushed me forward as I walked slowly toward the noise. The mist had thickened, making it difficult to see much beyond the faint glow of our dying fire. I couldn't see anyone else moving, so I assumed the others were still asleep, but the thumping kept getting louder and closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent, my boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. I moved the light around the camp, but I saw nothing unusual. As the cacophony intensified and the mist swirled around me, every stride seemed heavier. The limbs of the trees seemed to press in on me, reaching out in the dark like hands. I persisted, breathing clearly in the chilly air, and as I approached, I noticed something odd. The ground was disturbed, as if something had been pulled through the dirt and leaves. My heart raced, but I resisted the urge to turn around and continued walking over the disturbed ground until I came to a small open space in the center of the clearing, where a massive tree with a twisted and gnarled trunk stood. I walked around the tree with my flashlight pointed straight ahead, trying to remain calm, but as I got around it, I froze. There was a huge hole in the ground, about 10 feet wide and 10 feet deep, with rough, freshly dug edges and pieces of earth scattered everywhere. At the bottom of the pit, something large and dark was moving slowly, and I squinted to make sense of what I was seeing. It appeared to be an animal, but it was too large and its movements were too deliberate, and I watched as it pulled something out of the ground, a long, thick root, possibly a branch, and repeatedly slammed it against the side of the pit, producing that terrible, continuous sound. Hit me hard. This wasn't an animal, it was a person, or what used to be a person, their body covered in mud, muscles straining as they dug desperately into the ground. The hole was filled with other things, 2 old bones, bits of cloth, and what looked like pieces of metal, or what it was, a grave or maybe several graves, all mashed together in one horrific pit. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This person had been digging for a long time alone out here in the woods, their mind gone from the isolation, or maybe something worse, and now they were creating this place, this pit of death. I turned and ran back to camp as fast as I could, my breath coming in short panic gasps. When I reached the tents, I collapsed to my knees, trying to calm myself down. My mind was spinning, trying to process what I'd just seen. We left the campsite at first light, no one saying a word about the night. I never told anyone about the pit, or the person digging it, but the memory of that sound, the steady thump of earth being moved, has stayed with me, haunting my thoughts now. Whenever I'm alone in the woods, I listen carefully, dreading the day I hear it again, because I know that if I do, it won't just be a sound in the distance, it will be close, too close, and I won't be able to turn away. The pit will be waiting, and this time I'll be the one pulled into the darkness. I had been looking forward to camping with a friend for weeks. We decided to hike to a secluded location, set up our tent by a peaceful lake, and spend a weekend away from everything. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful, with only the sound of trees rustling and gravel crunching beneath our tires. We parked, got our gear, and started hiking. The trail was difficult to see because it was covered in dense brush and trees. It was the kind of place you'd only find if you knew exactly where it was. We navigated the forest using an old map I found online, and as we went deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was cooler there, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. After a couple of hours, we reached the lake. It was small and almost hidden by the trees, with a surface as still as a mirror. We chose a spot on the far side away from any possible visitors. It was perfect. We set up the tent, collected some firewood, and got ready for the night. The first night was normal with just the usual forest sounds around us. By the second day, we had explored the area and even found an old abandoned cabin a short walk from our camp. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, with the roof falling in and the door barely hanging on. We peeked inside, but found nothing but dust and rotting wood. It was clear no one had been there for a long time. As night fell on the second day, the forest seemed to get quieter. We sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the sense of being alone. It was the kind of quiet that makes you notice every small sound: branches snapping, leaves rustling, and distant animal calls. But then we started hearing something different at first. It was faint, almost like wind, but it wasn't. It was a low, steady hum coming from deep in the woods. We both heard it, but neither of us said anything. It was probably just a natural sound we weren't used to, but the hum grew louder, and with it came a feeling I couldn't shake. It felt like we were being watched, like something was out there just beyond the firelight. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was all in my head. But as the night wore on, the hum became more and more noticeable. It was a rhythmic sound, almost like a low mechanical buzz, and as it got closer, my heart began to race. I could tell my friend was also tense, but we both tried to remain calm because we knew we were far from civilization, with no self-service and no easy way out. Then, as abruptly as it began, the sound stopped, and the forest was silent, as if it was holding its breath. We saw it moving in the trees just outside the fire's glow, darting between the trees too quickly to see clearly. This made my stomach turn, and I wanted to say something to suggest we pack up and leave, but I couldn't find the right words. Darkness. The forest was quiet again, but the unease persisted, like the tension before a storm. We barely slept that night, and when morning finally arrived, we were both on edge, so we decided to shorten our trip and packed up quickly without discussing what had happened. I grabbed more wood, but my hands were shaking as I threw the logs on the fire. Every sound made me jump, and every shadow seemed to conceal something waiting to pounce. When we finally arrived at the car, I felt a wave of relief. We threw our belongings in the back and drove off, and as we drove away, I looked back at the forest, which was now only a dark line on the horizon. The hum and movement had stopped, but the feeling of being watched persisted, and even after all this time, I still can't explain what happened that night because there were no ghosts or monsters. I haven't been back to those woods because I've learned that some places hold secrets that are better left undiscovered, and that some experiences leave marks that never completely go away. I never expected a camping trip with my mother-in-law to become so unsettling. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. The most unsettling part was just a sound and a feeling that something was out there that didn't want us there. I'm not sure if it was watching us or if it knew we were leaving. After dinner, we sat by the fire, and as darkness took over, the shadows from the trees seemed to stretch and twist in strange ways. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling and went to bed early in the hopes that a good night's sleep would help. Around midnight, I woke up to a scratching sound against the tent, my heart racing. I held my breath trying to listen, and the scratching stopped. In the hopes of finding some peace and quiet, my wife, her mother, and I chose a location distant from the hustle and bustle of the city, deep in the woods. I must have waited hours before I finally managed to peek outside the forest, which was perfectly peaceful and everything seemed normal, until I heard a faint dragging noise and lay there frozen, too afraid to move. I went back to sleep, but the apprehension persisted. The next morning, my mother-in-law seemed more exhausted than normal, with dark bags under her eyes and a nervous appearance. I remained silent, but I couldn't get rid of the sensation that something wasn't right. Later, we made the decision to go hiking. We followed a narrow path that took us farther into the forest. After an hour or so, I noticed new footprints in the dirt, but they weren't ours. They were tiny and appeared to be heading in the same direction as before, so I remained silent so as not to alarm anyone when we returned to the campsite. That night, the scratching sound returned louder and more persistent, and I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to make sure the forest was completely dark, with only my flashlight piercing the darkness. I discovered my wife and her mother huddled together, going through their belongings, some of which were missing personal items that weren't just misplaced but had been stolen. With my pulse racing, I scanned the campground and saw deep, odd marks in the ground that formed a circle around it. When I realized that they were too exact to be made by animals, my stomach dropped. I hurried back to the tent and tried to ignore the growing fear in my gut. I made up my mind, packed up our belongings, and told my wife that we were leaving immediately, despite her reluctance. We drove home in the middle of the night, feeling relieved as we left the forest behind. When we arrived home, I couldn't stop thinking about what we had escaped. The scratches, the missing items, and the eerie noises haunted me. I didn't find out until weeks later that the area where we camped had a history of strange occurrences and disappearances. The possibility that someone or something was watching us the whole time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to attack, is what terrifies me the most. I still wonder what would have occurred if we had spent an additional night. My grandmother enjoyed the outdoors and always claimed that it kept her feeling young. I was not as thrilled as she was, but I thought it would be wonderful to spend some time with her, so we went out to a remote location in the woods. I remember the camping trip with my grandmother as if it had occurred yesterday. Far away from any cities or people, Gran enjoyed the calm and tranquility. The first day was quite typical. We up our tent, had dinner over a fire, and watched the sun set behind the woods. Gran talked about the different plants and animals around us. Her voice was calm and steady, and it made me feel safe, like nothing could go wrong as long as she was there. That night, I fell asleep quickly, the sounds of the forest making me feel relaxed, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had burned down to just a few glowing bits of wood, and the night was completely dark. I could hear Gran breathing steadily from her side of the tent, so I knew she was still asleep. I tried to figure out what had woken me up. The night was still almost too quiet. I listened closely, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat, which was starting to race. I told myself it was nothing, just the unfamiliar place making me nervous, and tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard something moving outside the tent. It was faint, like a soft shuffling through the leaves. At first I thought it might be a deer or some other harmless animal, but then the sound got louder, closer, like whatever it was moving around our campsite. I lay there frozen, not sure what to do. My eyes were wide open, staring into the dark, trying to see something that wasn't there. The noise stopped and I felt a small bit of relief, thinking it had moved on. But then I heard it again right outside the tent, just inches from where I was lying. The sound was different now, not like an animal, more like someone dragging their feet through the dirt. My mind raced with all kinds of thoughts, none of them good. I didn't want to wake Gran, thinking it might just be my imagination, but as the minutes passed, the sound didn't stop. It only got worse. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. I reached for the flashlight by my side, my hands shaking. I didn't want to turn it on, scared of what I might see, but I had to know what was out there. Just as I was about to turn on the light, the dragging sound stopped again, followed by an eerie silence. I held my breath, listening, waiting for something to happen. The silence dragged on, and I started to think that maybe whatever it was had left. Maybe it was all in my head, just me being paranoid about being in the woods at night. I slowly relaxed my grip on the flashlight, easing up. That's when I felt something brush against the side of the tent right where I was sitting. It was subtle, but it was definitely there, like a hand or a branch lightly touching the tent fabric. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would explode out of my chest. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm down. I needed to stay clear-headed, to think this through. I decided to wait it out, to see if whatever was out there would leave, but the minutes felt like hours, and the silence was only broken by the occasional rustling too close for comfort. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. No more dragging, no more rustling, just the sound of my own breathing and GR's soft snores. I must have fallen asleep when I woke up, because it was morning and sunlight was shining through the trees, and everything appeared so normal and serene that it was difficult to believe that the previous night had even occurred. I sat there for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for the noise to return, but it never did. Gran had already risen and was preparing breakfast by the fire. I didn't tell her what I had heard, and she didn't say anything either. Perhaps it was better that way. After breakfast, we packed up our camp, and I felt a strange sense of relief as we drove away from the woods. But as we left, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had been out there with us that night, something that didn't belong. I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone or something watching us from the trees. I can't explain what happened, but I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had turned on that flashlight. I'm never going back to those woods, but sometimes in the middle of the night, when everything is quiet and dark, I can almost hear that dragging sound outside getting closer. One weekend, I decided to go camping alone in the mountains, something I'd always wanted to do, just me, the woods, and some peace and quiet away from everything. I chose a spot far from other campers and set up my tent. The weather was fantastic, and the view of the trees stretching as far as I could see was exactly what I needed. I cooked some food and sat by the fire as night slowly settled and the woods got darker and quieter with every minute, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the rustling of leaves now and then. It was peaceful, just like I'd imagined, but something felt a bit off. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just a little nervous being out here alone. When the fire began to die down, I decided to go to sleep. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up to keep out the night. As I lay there, the quiet started to feel heavier. Every little noise outside seemed louder, the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest, nothing to worry about. But then I heard something different, heavy, slow steps on the leaves, like someone walking. They were slow, steady, and coming closer to my tent. My heart started pounding, and I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent, and everything went silent again. I could hear my heartbeat thing in my chest. I stayed still, too scared to move. After what seemed like an eternity, I listened intently as the footsteps began to move away again. This time, The tight feeling in my chest subsided a little, and I tried to convince myself that it was just a deer or perhaps a large raccoon, even though I knew deep down that no animal walks like that. The following morning, I woke up shaken, but I tried not to let the night get to me. I looked around the campsite, looking for any signs of what might have been there, when I noticed something unsettling in the dirt near my tent. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, trying to keep myself together, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each minute, even though I couldn't see anyone. I knew I had to go. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking as I stuffed everything into my backpack. As I hiked back to my car, every sound in the forest made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just the same quiet woods stretching out in every direction like they were hiding any sign of whoever or whatever had been there during the night. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and got out of there as fast as I could. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I was miles away from the campsite. I haven't been camping since that trip. I still don't know what really happened, but I know those footsteps were real. Someone was out there in the woods that night, standing right outside my tent watching me. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part is the thought that's been haunted me ever since. What if they weren't just watching me? What if they were waiting for something, a moment when I wasn't paying attention, to make their move? The more I think about it, the more I realize how lucky I was to get out of there when I did, but that luck might not hold if I ever go back, and that's something that keeps me awake at night, wondering if they're still out there waiting for someone else to come along. The air was cool when I got to the campsite, a remote spot deep in the woods. It had been years since I was last here with my ex-wife, and now it was just me. I set up the tent, started a fire, and tried to push away the awkward memories of her. Night fell quickly, and the forest grew dark. The fire crackled, the only light amid the deepening darkness was softly thrown. I was beginning to unwind when I heard a little rhythmic tapping, but I couldn't tell whether it was coming from a wayward branch or the wind. As the night wore on, I ignored it and concentrated on the warmth of the fire. The tapping became louder and more annoying, as if someone was tapping out a pattern or knocking. I checked outside the tent but found nothing, so I went back inside, but the sound persisted, now accompanied by an odd scraping noise. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to fall asleep because the noises kept getting louder and more aggressive, and the tent seemed to be shaking a little even though there was no wind. I finally unzipped the flap to check outside. The night was still and silent, and the fire was dying down. I walked around the edge of the campsite looking for anything that might explain the noises. As I neared the edge of the clearing, I spotted something out, a shallow hole partly covered with leaves and dirt. I could see a corner of a wooden box sticking out. My heart raced as I dug up the box. It was old, and the wood was damp. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were personal items, photos, letters, and a diary. The stuff looked like it had been buried for a long time. There was also a map with a mark point pointing to a spot nearby. A cold shiver ran down my spine when I saw that the diary had entries about the campsite and the area around it. The last entry was from around the time of our last visit. It talked about someone watching from the woods and the need to leave before it was too late. Fear gripped me. I quickly packed up, deciding it was best to get out of there before anything else happened. As I drove away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods were dark and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that had been waiting for me to dig up the box. I never went back to that campsite, and I never told anyone about what I found. The sense of dread stayed with me, a constant reminder that some places hold dark secrets to this day. I wonder if the things watching from the woods are still there, waiting for the next person To uncover what should have stayed buried, I decided to go camping at a spot my neighbor had mentioned. It wasn't a place many people knew about, which made it seem like the perfect escape. A peaceful weekend away from the bustle of the city seemed ideal. I set up my tent and built a small fire after leaving early in the morning and traveling through winding, narrow roads lined with dense trees. As I got closer, the trees seemed to get taller and denser, making the road darker. The road eventually turned into a bumpy dirt path, and I soon arrived at the campsite, which was a small open area surrounded by woods with only a distant stream barely breaking the silence. As the sun went down, the temperature fell and the woods became even darker. The day went by peacefully, with just the sounds of birds and rustling leaves around me. I noticed something odd when the woods, which had been filled with animal sounds and rustling leaves, suddenly went quiet. It wasn't just any quiet, everything just stopped all at once. I felt a cold chill run through me, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The fire's light only illuminated a small area around me, leaving everything else in deep shadow. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up to small sounds like something moving outside the tent. The noises were quiet, like something light stepping on leaves. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but with every noise the uneasy feeling grew stronger. In the early morning hours, I heard something I couldn't ignore. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, careful, and definitely human, moving around my campsite. They were trying to be quiet, as if they didn't want to be heard. My heart started racing as I lay there holding my breath, listening to the slow steps. I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping every few seconds. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, hoping that whoever it was would just leave, but they didn't. Instead, they stopped right next to my tent, so close that I could hear them breathing. I waited, not knowing what to do. Every second felt like it stretched on forever. Then, without warning, the footsteps started moving away. Slowly at first, then faster, until they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, too scared to move or make a sound. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up my things as fast as I could. I didn't even stop to eat. I just wanted to get out of there. I left the campsite and made my way back to the car, feeling like something was watching me the entire time. When I finally arrived at my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my belongings in the back, got in, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, the feeling of being watched gradually fading as I increased my distance from that location. But when I got home, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone was still watching me. The woods had seemed so peaceful the day before, but now they felt like they were concealing something dangerous. Whatever it was, it followed me back and wasn't just in the trees. That night, as I lay in bed, I double-checked the locks on all of my doors, but the uneasy feeling persisted. Outside my window, I heard a soft creak that sounded like someone stepping on a loose board, and I froze, barely breathing, as the sound approached. It was the same slow, careful footsteps I had heard in the woods, but the woods weren't as empty as they seemed. Sometimes what follows you home doesn't just stay outside, it's already inside, waiting for the right moment to let you know you're never alone. And this time, there's nowhere to run. About 5 years ago, my sister, a friend of mine, my girlfriend, and I decided to take a trip to Sierra County, California, deep in the mountains near a small town called Downeyville. We were heading to a brew fest in town and chose to camp rather than book a hotel. We took a road called Kala, also known as Forest Road 25, which eventually becomes Forest Road 55, looking for an off-grid camping spot. We drove about 7 miles up this road from the main road leading to Downeyville, which was at least 5 or 6. Miles before reaching the town, there wasn't much out there except for a few campsites right off the main road. We hadn't gone much farther when we found a clearing among the trees and decided to set up camp. As we were finishing setting up around sunset, an older woman suddenly appeared walking into our camp from the woods. She was dressed in what looked like hippie-style clothing, probably around 60 years old, frail and small with brownish gray hair. My first thought was how strange it was because there were no cars or other signs of people anywhere on this road. I asked her what she was doing up there, and she said she was camping just on the other side of the creek with her husband. Then she asked if we had any water, which seemed odd given how far we were from civilization. We gave her some water, and she then asked for a cigarette. I asked if she had come from Downeyville, but she said no, she was from Culvert, pointing further up the mountain, saying they had been walking for a long time. I offered her the rest of my cigarettes, telling her I would buy more in Downeyville. She seemed oddly moved by this gesture. She pulled a silver cross necklace from her collar and insisted I take it. Not being religious, I refused, but she kept insisting more seriously each time. My girlfriend's sister and friend were watching this, clearly creeped out. There was something strange about her, like she wasn't from modern times. Even when I handed her the water bottle, it seemed foreign to her. Eventually we told her we had to leave, and she wandered back into the woods. On our way out, we looked for any sign of another camp or car in the direction she pointed to, but found nothing. We returned to camp around 11:30 or midnight, had a campfire, and then went to bed around 1 a.m. At around 3 a.m. my sister, who was in a tent down the hill near the creek, said she heard something walking around on the other side of the creek. We talked back and forth for about 20 minutes. I couldn't hear much, but she was getting more and more scared, so I told her to come sleep in my tent with my girlfriend, and I would sleep in hers. I had a .45 pistol and didn't think much of it. We traded spots, and I went back to sleep in her tent. About 20 minutes later, I heard something walking around near us, very distinctly, pacing back and forth in the woods. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it definitely wasn't a small animal. This went on for about an hour, with me falling asleep and then being woken up again. I was getting unnerved and a bit annoyed since I was trying to sleep off some beer. It kept going until I heard whatever it was start crossing the creek and coming up the embankment toward my tent. It walked right past my tent and towards our fire and my truck, which was backed up to the fire. I heard something rustling around our camp and then heard something banging on metal. I realized whatever it was trying to break into my Bronco. My first thought was that it was a bear smelling food in the truck. Now I was really freaked out. With no other option, unzipping my tent slowly and silently, I cautiously poked my head out with my gun and looked toward my truck and the fire. To my surprise, I saw a full-grown buckhorn standing there, staring at the fire's embers as if it were trying to warm up. I was relieved, but I chose to frighten it away by hitting the tent's wall. I shouted, "Get out of here," half out of the doorway, and to my surprise, the deer just turned its head and looked at me before turning back to the fire. I tried again, louder and more animated, but this time it slowly turned and began to walk towards me, which was really unsettling because deer are normally afraid of people and don't approach them at this point. It was a big buck. I hastily returned to the tent, zipped it up, and waited until the buck approached. From the fur light on the tent wall, I could see its silhouette. It stood beside my tent entrance for a good minute or two before continuing to prowl around our campsite until it eventually wandered off in the same direction the woman had gone. Throughout the night, I kept hearing something different from a deer moving around near the creek on the other side. I barely slept, but it was about 5 in the morning. I must have dozed off because I was suddenly woken up by the sound of the woman on the other side of the creek calling out, "Hello, can you hear me? Can I have some water? Water, I'm really thirsty." I ignored her because I was so damn tired, and because it was so damn creepy. She stopped, then came back about 15 minutes later calling out again. She did this a few times, and it just weirded me out. It was just starting to get light in the sky, really early morning. We all got up, packed up, and began the 2.5-hour drive home. On the way out, I pulled off on a dirt path to see if I could spot her camped down an embankment. I found an old fire ring, cold as the earth, clearly not used in a while, but there were signs someone had been there recently, like Camel cigarette butts, the same brand I smoke. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold, a whole head of brownish gray hair like a wig that had fallen apart, just lying in the dirt where it looked like someone had been lying. It looked exactly like the woman's hair. I got back in my truck and got out of there fast. The next morning after getting home, I went out to my truck and noticed my license plate was gone, like it had been torn off. If it had been missing at the campsite, we would have noticed. I can't help but think that whatever that deer or whatever it was that had been messing with my tailgate took it. Just weird, creepy stuff, man. My only regret is not going more often, but I've stayed overnight in the Yosemite Valley area twice. The first time was at a housekeeping camp, where I knew the accommodations were close to others, so I assumed the other visitors enjoying themselves, clearly with a lot of alcohol, was okay. I don't drink, and I can't understand why anyone would come to such an amazing place just to get wasted, but everyone has their reasons. I find YNP to be an amazing and enchanting place, and I feel incredibly fortunate to be within driving distance of a place that people travel to see every year. With the exception of the individuals next to me who chose to drink all night and, as is frequently the case with AL's drinks, became louder and louder until 4 a.m., I was there for mine and others came for theirs, and I accepted that. They weren't obnoxious, but they were very loud, and I didn't get any quality sleep. My plans for the next day were ruined as I was exhausted and frustrated. Then this past weekend, I stayed in camp for again. I knew the campsites were practically on top of each other, but was still hoping for the best. The group of 3 who were set up about 10 feet from our tent seemed pretty low-key. They were playing music at a low volume and just chatting. I was worn out from a long day of hiking, crawled into the tent around 8:30 and quickly fell asleep. About an hour and a half later, I woke up to hear one of the people in the trio right next to me crying hysterically, clearly drunk, loud and sobbing like they just lost a loved one or a pet. This went on for over an hour. Finally calmed down, and I fell back asleep. At about 13, I woke up again to the same person literally wrenching and puking their guts out just outside their tent loudly, and they kept vomiting all night long into the next morning. It sounded like they had alcohol poisoning and probably should have packed up and gone home or to urgent care. It was that bad. I could hear their campmates trying to get this person to drink water or eat something, but they refused and just sat outside their tent puking and dry heaving. It was awful. Continue all night. I didn't get any decent rest. My plans for a full day of hiking were now ruined, but worse, I was angry. I was tired and feeling this unpleasant frustration bubbling up inside me. It was the opposite of how I wanted to feel when visiting this beautiful, magical place that brings me peace. I got up the next morning and saw that this person had vomited all over the campsite. As we were packing to leave as soon as possible, I put off eating anything that wasn't surprising and packed up everything. This person was still making terrible noises and sticking their head out of the tent when other campers from nearby sites approached and offered them food and coffee, but they turned them down. Is the valley always full of drunk idiots, or am I just unlucky? The bright side of all this is that I found a much better place than I would have imagined before. I thought that camping with my ex-husband might help us clear the air and possibly even bring some peace between us. We didn't split up in a big fight, but there was always this tension that never really went away. So spending a few days in the woods together seemed like a good way to end things on a positive note. I won't be staying in the valley again. I drove over to Tioga Pass and checked out the Tamarack campground, and it looks amazing, huge spots and secluded. The plan was straightforward: a small campfire, a quiet area by the lake, and nothing but nature surrounding us. The first day was peaceful. We set up the tent, collected some firewood, and sat by the water, watching the sun slowly set beneath the trees. It was almost too quiet, but as night fell, the air grew colder, and I felt a tight feeling in my stomach that wasn't just from the temperature. I couldn't figure out what was wrong that night because I couldn't sleep well. Every little sound seemed louder and sharper. I kept telling myself that it was just the forest and that nothing else existed, but no matter how many times I heard the rustling of leaves and the breaking of twigs, it still made me uneasy. I tried to reassure myself that something was wrong, but I couldn't get warm no matter what I did. The following morning, something felt different. There was a strange tension in the air that was even thicker than before, and we didn't talk much, just went about our business as if nothing was wrong. However, the longer we stayed outside, the more I noticed small details, like the way he kept looking at me when he thought I wasn't looking, and the way he was quieter than usual, almost too quiet, as if he was waiting for something, and I couldn't tell. By the second night, the forest seemed darker, the sounds more menacing, the wind howling through the trees, and I felt like the darkness was closing in around us. I tried to ignore the growing fear by focusing on the warmth and light of the campfire, but it wasn't enough. Then I noticed things that made me feel really uneasy. His movements were odd and purposeful, and he kept pointing at the fire, but his eyes kept darting toward the tent and back to me. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, but there was something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. It wasn't exactly fear, but it was close. That night, I didn't sleep at all, so I lay there listening to the sounds outside and his breathing next to me. I felt trapped in darkness with no way out, and all I could think about was leaving him and whatever this was becoming. When morning finally arrived, I was tired, but I knew I had to leave. When I told him that I wasn't feeling well and that I needed to return early, he didn't argue, he just nodded, but the way he looked at me made my heart race. There was something dark in his eyes that I didn't want to face, so I kept my distance and made sure to stay close to the car as we drove back to town. The tension didn't even slightly lessen. In fact, it got worse. The road felt longer. The air inside the car felt heavier, and I could feel his eyes on me even when I wasn't looking. When we finally returned, I packed up and left without saying anything, but the uneasiness lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong during that trip, something that wasn't just about us. A few days later, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a small tear in my sleeping bag right where my back would have been. It wasn't big, but it looked like it had been made with something sharp. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood out clear as day. I tried to think back, tried to remember when it could have happened, but I couldn't. The more I thought about it, the more things started to make sense. The way he had been acting, the looks he gave me, the silence. It wasn't just the woods that had me on edge, it was him. I had gone out there thinking it was just a simple camping trip, but now I wasn't so sure. I couldn't prove anything, couldn't say for certain what had been on his mind, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't safe with him anymore. I couldn't shake the thought of how easily things could have gone wrong out there. We were alone, far from anyone who could help, and I kept wondering, what if that small tear in my sleeping bag had been meant for more than just a scare. What if it had been a warning, a reminder that no matter how things had ended between us, there was still a dark side to him that I hadn't fully seen before? That thought still keeps me up at night, because now I know there's a part of him I don't recognize, a part that I don't think I ever will, and I can't help but wonder if that part of him is waiting for the right moment to come back to finish what he might have started out. There in the woods, that's a fear I can't shake, no matter how much I try to convince myself that it's over, because deep down I know it's not. I was always close to my sister-in-law Sarah. We got along great, and our families spent a lot of weekends together, so when she suggested a weekend camping trip, I thought it was a good idea. We figured it would be a good way to get away from work stress and the noise of the city. I had been camping before, but this time felt different. I couldn't shake a weird feeling that something was wrong. We picked a spot deep in the woods. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be a peaceful night away from any town. The drive up was pleasant. The trees grew thicker as we continued into the forest, and the campsite was lovely, right by a small clear lake. The first night was quiet. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and laughed until we were too exhausted to stay awake. But the following day I began to notice things that didn't seem right. At first, it was small things. The forest's usual rustling of leaves and animal sounds had ceased, and the sounds of the forest seemed too quiet. Along the coast, I saw fresh footprints that weren't ours, that led out of the sea and vanished into the woods. I kept my thoughts about those footprints to myself, since I didn't want to frighten Sarah, but they were too large for a regular human. Later that night, as we sat by the fire once again, I heard a low, deep sound that sounded like a growl in the distance. I tried to convince myself that it was simply my imagination playing tricks on me, but it didn't make the bad feeling go away. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a bear, far out in the woods, but Sarah didn't appear to hear it, or, if she did, she didn't respond. When we eventually went to bed, however, the sense that something wasn't right just became worse, and I couldn't sleep at all. I jumped as I heard the sound outside. The wind. I lay in my tent, peering up into the darkness, listening for anything, and then I heard it growl again, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Through the trees, the break of a limb, the rustle of leaves, everything sounded louder. With my heart pounding, I sat up and listened to the slow, cautious footsteps coming from just outside the tent. It sounded like whatever was out there didn't want to be heard, so I held my breath. The footsteps circled the tent and then stopped right at the entrance. I could hear heavy, rough breathing that sounded like something large was only a few inches away, and I wanted to scream to wake Sarah, but I was too afraid to move. The breathing continued for what seemed like an eternity before abruptly stopping and the footsteps gradually moving away. Fading into the night, I was afraid to move until the sun rose, at which point I hurried out of the tent. The ground outside was uneven, with big tracks pressed into the soil that led back into the trees from the tent. I woke Sarah, and we packed up as fast as we could without speaking to each other. When we drove home, the silence was heavy, and we both knew that something had been watching us. We never talked about what had happened that night, but we never went camping again because we were too afraid of what might have happened if we hadn't left when we did. I'll never know, but I don't need to. The thought of what might have happened is enough to keep me from ever returning. However, the thing that still haunts me, the thing I can't forget, is that those footprints didn't just come from the woods. They led back into the lake, whatever was out there, And now every time I see a quiet lake, what may be waiting for its next opportunity to emerge just under the surface, I wonder. I've always enjoyed camping because it makes me feel free. This time, I'm planning to camp for a few days by myself, so I found a peaceful area close to a small lake in the middle of the woods. The only indication of other people is a tent set up a few hundred yards away. A man I had met before called himself my neighbor in the wild. He seemed friendly, a little older, and he was dressed in faded camouflage. He mentioned that he was a retired commander in the military. The first day passed without any problems. I spent the morning setting up my camp, gathering firewood, and getting ready for a quiet evening under the stars. As the sun started to set, I noticed my neighbor standing by the water staring out at nothing. There was something odd about the way he stood, stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. The next morning I woke up to find him gone. His tent was still there, but he was nowhere to be seen. First I didn't worry. People often head out early to hike or fish, but as the day went on and he didn't come back, I started to feel uneasy. The air felt heavy, and the forest was unusually quiet. I tried to focus on my own tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time night came, he still hadn't returned. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it didn't feel right to just leave without knowing what had happened, so I decided to walk over to his campsite and check things out. His tent was shut, everything neatly packed away like he hadn't planned to be gone for long. I walked around his campsite calling out, but there was only silence. When I saw a small patch of disturbed dirt near his tent, I thought it might have been the site of recent excavation, but it had been hastily covered up. My heart began to race, and I felt panic rising, but I forced myself to remain composed. I found a stick and dug, and as I removed the dirt, I discovered a shallow pit with a few objects, including a knife. A worn dog tag and a notebook caught my eye. The dog tag had a name I didn't recognize, but the notebook was what really caught my attention. As I turned through the pages, I discovered notes about survival skills, old military missions, and oddly, entries about this exact camping trip. The last entry made my blood run cold. It explained that he had been following a man who fit my description and that he was planning to kill the target because the mission wasn't finished. There was no name, but the description was too similar to mine. Because of his anxiety and fixation on this mission, he thought I was an adversary. When I heard a twig break behind me, I swung around. But no one was there. I was alone in the clearing, but I could feel eyes on me. I had frozen the forest because it was suddenly too quiet and too near. My thoughts were racing. He could have been in the military before, but something had obviously struck him, and he determined that I was the enemy. I didn't stay to see what he had intended to do, so I dropped the notebook and hurried back to my camp. With my hands trembling, I packed up my belongings as quickly as I could, hoping he would arrive at any minute. However, he never appeared, and the only noises were the rustle of leaves in the breeze and my pounding pulse. Even today, I can't get rid of the notion that he's still out there, his twisted sense of duty driving him to finish a task that never existed. Even though I left the forest that night and drove nonstop until I was miles away, I can still see him waiting by the lake when I lie awake at night, and I can't help but wonder if he's found a new target or if he'll find me again. I know I should move on from it, but there's something about the way he looked at me that makes me think this isn't over. Perhaps it's just paranoia. Or perhaps it's the reality that he's still looking and that I'll never be completely safe. While my husband was away on a business trip, I made the decision to take my kids camping for the weekend. It was just the two of us, and we wanted to make some memories. We found a peaceful area at a small campground by a lake, which was only a few hours from home, so it seemed like the ideal location, safe, accessible, and yet far enough away to feel like an adventure. The first day went well. We set up the tent, roasted marshmallows, and the kids had a great time splashing around in the lake. It was nice to be away from the routine, and when nightfall arrived, I put the kids in their sleeping bags and sat by the fire to enjoy the quiet. The stars were bright, the fire crackled softly, and everything was peaceful. I started to relax. The campground was small, and from what I could see, there weren't many other people there. There were a few tents scattered about, but it felt like we had the place to ourselves. At midnight, I made the decision to call it a night because the kids were asleep and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. In the middle of the night, I woke up, got into the tent, zipped it up, and laid down next to them. At first, I was unsure of why, but then I heard a faint crunching sound that sounded like someone walking on gravel. I froze and listened carefully, and as the sound seemed to be approaching the tent, my heart began to race. I thought it might be an animal, but the footsteps were too heavy and controlled, so I reached out to make sure the kids were still asleep so I wouldn't wake them up and frighten them. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent, and I could hear someone or something breathing slowly and heavily, almost as if they were trying to remain undetected. My mind raced because I had no way to see who or what was outside without making noise, and there was no easy escape. The person outside began moving again, dragging their feet and walking around the tent, and I could see a shadow shifting through the tent fabric as they moved. Then, as abruptly as it began, the noise stopped, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, waiting, but I heard nothing. I felt completely trapped, staying perfectly still and barely daring to breathe. The minutes felt like hours. I must have fallen asleep at some point because my body was sore and tense, but when I woke up, it was morning, the sun was just rising, and the kids were still sound asleep next to me. I quietly unzipped the tent and looked outside, but the ground was disturbed. It appeared as though someone had been walking in circles around our tent all night. We packed up quickly, but as soon as the kids were awake, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we had been watched. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us, and I still can't forget that night. The thing that scares me the most is the idea that whoever was out there might still be watching, waiting for the next opportunity to get closer. Since then, I haven't taken the kids camping. I have been looking forward to this camping trip with my son for weeks. We set up our tent by a small, quiet lake surrounded by dense woods, far from other campsites. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just the two of us away from the noise and stress of everyday life. The first day went well, and we spent time cooking and fishing over the campfire. At nightfall, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of animals in the bushes. I felt content as I watched my son go to sleep in his sleeping bag at midnight. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise, a soft, steady tapping, coming from outside the tent. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it might be a branch moving in the wind, but the tapping became louder and seemed to come from different directions. Under the moonlight, the woodland seemed eerie as I silently unzipped the tent and ventured outdoors to attempt to locate the source of the sound. I thought it was just the wind, so I took a few steps away from the tent and saw nothing strange, just the dark shapes of the trees. However, the tapping continued all night and seemed to get closer each time. When I looked around the campsite the following morning, I saw no signs of animals or other people, just the same peaceful forest. We decided to go on a hike to try to get my mind off the strange noises, and when we returned to the campsite in the evening, everything seemed fine at first. I started preparing dinner while my son played by the water, and when I looked up, I noticed something strange on the tent. Tiny muddy handprints the size of a child's hand were smeared on the fabric. This made my spine tingle. I looked around the tent and couldn't find any footprints or other indications of anyone being there, so I tried to think it was a prank or possibly a stray animal. However, as night fell, the tapping resumed, this time louder and more urgent, as if someone was trying to get inside. I decided we would leave early the following morning, so I stayed up all night watching the tent and listening to the tapping. At dawn, I heard scurrying sounds near the tent, but I never saw anything. We packed up quickly and drove home, but once we got back, I couldn't get rid of the dread. Later, I learned that other campers in the area had also reported hearing similar noises, and even seeing strange figures in the woods. Looking back, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety that we had just barely avoided a far worse disaster, even though no one could explain what was occurring. The journey began as a straightforward father-son adventure came to an end with a terrifying reminder that the woods have more secrets than we realize. The muddy handprints and the odd tapping were never explained, but they left a lasting impression on my memory. Sometimes, I wonder what was waiting and watching in the dark just beyond the edge of our campsite. My name is Logan Carter and I'm 34 years old. What I'm about to tell you isn't some tall tale for clicks or likes, it's the truth even if I can't prove it. This happened in the summer of last year deep in the heart of Hockock Swamp, Massachusetts, a place some people call the heart of the Bridgewater Triangle. I went in as a skeptic thinking I'd spend a week documenting my survivalist skills for my blog. I came out broken both physically and mentally, and I'm still not sure if I escaped it all. It started with an idea I'd had for months: test my skills by surviving 7 days alone in one of the most notoriously haunted places in the country. I didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. I thought the stories were just folklore blown out of proportion, so I packed my gear: tent, GPS, water purifier, knives, and my GoPro and drove to the edge of the swamp. The first thing you notice in Hockock Swamp is the silence. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just the occasional drip of water and the squelch of mud underfoot. It was oppressive, but I chalked it up to the swamp's natural atmosphere. By late afternoon, I found a clearing to set up camp. As I hammered stakes into the soggy ground, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but there was nothing but dense trees and mist. Get a grip, I muttered, shaking off the unease. That night I built a small fire and recorded my first blog entry. I talked about the swamp's history, how the Wampanoag people believed it was a place of great spiritual power, and how locals whispered about strange lights and creatures. As I spoke, the words felt heavier than I expected, like they carried a weight I didn't understand. I fell asleep to the crackling of the fire. When I woke up, the fire was out and something fell off. As I stepped outside the tent, I froze. Bare footprints surrounded my campsite. They were human-like, but too large, with long claw-like toes. Maybe a prank, I whispered, though the words felt hollow. Who would trek this far into the swamp just to mess with me, and why wouldn't I have heard them? I brushed it off, deciding to explore further into the swamp. My GPS flickered in and out, forcing me to rely on a map. Around midday, I stumbled upon something bizarre, a crude shrine made of animal bones and sticks perched on a stone slab. The air around it was colder, almost suffocating. I took a few photos and moved on quickly, feeling an inexplicable dread that night. As I edited footage by the fire, I noticed my knife was missing. I searched the tent, my backpack, nothing. Finally, I found it stuck in a nearby tree blade first, as though it had been thrown with precision. My stomach churned. I didn't sleep well. On the third day, my water purifier broke. I cursed under my breath, knowing I'd have to boil water from now on, which would cost me precious time and energy. The swamp seemed to mock me, its stillness amplified by my rising frustration. That night the whispers began. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I lay in my tent the sounds became distinct, my name spoken softly over and over. Logan, Logan, help me. It sounded like my ex-girlfriend's voice, fragile and pleading. My rational mind told me it was a trick of isolation, a manifestation of guilt, but when I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the whispers moved, retreating into the darkness. I didn't follow. On the fourth day, I stumbled upon the shrine again, or at least I thought it was the same one. This time the bones were arranged differently and symbols were carved into the trees around it. What the hell? I muttered, taking a step back. That's when I saw a figure in the distance, crouched low to the ground. It was humanoid, but distorted, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, just watched me. I don't remember running back to camp, but I must have. By the fifth day, I was a mess. My gear felt like a hindrance more than a help. And I was down to my last energy bar. The whispers had grown louder at night, and my maps didn't seem to align with the terrain anymore. I was lost that evening. As I boiled water over a dwindling fire, I heard a branch snap. I turned and saw it, the figure from before, now closer. Its face, it was my face, but wrong, stretched and twisted. Leave me alone, I shouted, throwing a rock at it. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it mimicked my voice. Leave me alone. I backed into the, clutching my knife like a lifeline. Desperation clawed at me. On the sixth day, I tried to retrace my steps to the edge of the swamp, but every path seemed to loop back to the shrine. I felt trapped, like the swamp itself was conspiring against me. That night the entity grew bolder. It slashed at my tent, tearing through the fabric like paper. I scrambled out, swinging my knife wildly, but the creature danced just out of reach. It was toying with me. On the final day, I decided I had nothing to lose. I gathered dry branches and doused the shrine in lighter fluid. As the flames roared to life, the swamp seemed to shudder. The entity appeared again, screaming, not a human scream, but a guttural, animalistic roar. It charged at me, its claws slicing across my arm. As I stumbled backward, I swung my knife blindly, connecting with something solid. The creature shrieked and disappeared into the shadows. I ran. When I finally emerged from the swamp, I collapsed into the arms of a search and rescue team. I'd missed my check-in by 3 days, and they'd been combing the area. They didn't believe me about the creature. My footage was corrupted, and the photos I'd taken of the shrine were blurred beyond recognition. But sometimes late at night, I hear it, the whisper my name. The swamp didn't let me go. It just gave me a head start. I thought it was just another quiet shift, but that night in Crooked Pine National Forest, I learned silence is where terror hides. I am James Lopez. Prior to switching to city planning, I was a park ranger. I am 31 years old. Although I've always been the kind to remain composed under duress, that weekend in Ocala National Forest permanently altered my perspective on the world and myself. I'll do my best to describe what we experienced without coming off as crazy. In April of 2012, this occurred. I made the decision to take an RV excursion into the center of Ocala with my girlfriend Emma and 2 pals, Tyler and Kelly. The group's intention was that Emma, 30, who has always been a huge environment lover, would show us Alexander Springs, where the water is pristine and the paths provide excitement. My boyhood buddy Tyler, 28, and his girlfriend, Kelly, were traveling with him mostly because they both liked camping, albeit Kelly preferred the security of an RV over the harsh outdoors. In retrospect, I wish I had believed Kelly's uneasiness from the beginning. On a Friday, we arrived to our campground in the middle of the day, eager to get away from the bustle of the city. I rented my brother's RV, and it was parked in a clearing with tall trees all around. There was a new perfume in the air, the type that only comes from being deep in the forest. We unloaded rapidly. Emma and I would use the RV, and Tyler and Kelly would have tents. You see? Tyler slapped me on the back and said, "Perfect. Dude, we needed this. Bring the old gang together." Emma was already using her camera to explore the wooded area. She yelled back, "The biodiversity here is incredible," with a hint of enthusiasm in her voice. "It's so quiet, though." There was silence. Uncannily so. Typically, you would hear insects buzzing, birds chirping, or some other sound. Rather, the woods seemed to be holding its breath. I attributed it to the fact that I was further out than normal. The first night went without incident. We cooked marshmallows, lit a fire, and recited the same corny tales Tyler and I had been telling since we were adolescents. But Kelly didn't appear at ease. She continued to lean in closer to Tyler while looking over her shoulder. "What's up?" I questioned her. Shrugging, "Nothing," she said. It's just, it's so dark out here." "It's the woods, Kel," said Tyler, grinning. "It's supposed to be dark." After laughing it off, we retired to bed. The forest had already begun to watch us, although I was unaware of it at the time. Emma persuaded us to explore a neighboring route the next morning. I thought we should stretch our legs because she was so excited to explore. Despite her reluctance, Kelly joined. Emma froze before we had gone very far. She indicated a single footprint on the ground. Big and barefoot. It wasn't just large, however. The lengthy toes had what seemed to be claw marks on the tips. "Bear?" Tyler made a guess. "No," cowering, Emma replied. "Bears don't leave prints like this." Kelly stepped back. "Let's just return. This doesn't seem right." "Calm down," Tyler remarked, dismissing it. "It's most likely an odd hiker. Out here, people are peculiar." Emma looked at me, furrowed brows. I gave her a signal to continue going. The more we hiked, the more eerie it seemed. The odd twig cracking seemed intentional as the woods became quieter, as if someone or something was pursuing us. Even Tyler's customary arrogance started to waver, and Kelly continued murmuring that she wanted to turn back. The sense that we weren't alone persisted in my mind. Everyone was anxious by the time we returned to camp. We made the decision to spend the night near the RV. Emma was shouting my name while I was gathering firewood close to the clearing's edge. "James." It was far away, from further into the forest. I scowled. A minute earlier, Emma had been near the flames. "James, come here." The voice had become louder. Persistent. Despite my intuition that something wasn't right, curiosity prevailed. I crossed the line of trees. "Emma?" I made a call. The voice ceased. I almost ran into Emma herself as I turned back toward camp. She inquired, panting, "Where were you going?" "I heard you," I trembled. "You were calling me." Her face became white. I didn't say anything. Things worsened that night. I awoke to the sound of activity outside the RV at about midnight. The pine needles crunched with slow, deliberate footsteps. I pushed Emma to her feet and pleaded with her to be quiet. I saw a person close to the fire pit as I peered through the curtain. Although humanoid, it was incorrect. Its stance was hunched, as if it had been shattered and reassembled, and its limbs were too lengthy. With my pulse pounding, I picked up a flashlight and went outside. "Who's there?" I let out a bark. I think the figure grinned as it turned to face me. It was a broad, artificial smile that made my stomach turn, not a welcoming one. It rushed into the trees with animalistic speed and disappeared before I could respond. We discovered the smoldering remnants of our firewood strewn around and deep claw marks on the RV's side the next morning. With trepidation, Tyler laughed. "Okay, so someone's messing with us." "Someone?" Emma retaliated. "You think a person did that?" "It's probably a prank," said Tyler. "Locals messing with tourists." Kelly wasn't persuaded. "Tyler, this isn't typical. Last night's creature wasn't human." Emma raised her voice. "Skinwalkers are the subject of a Navajo mythology. Shapeshifters who pose as humans or animals in order to trick you. They can imitate looks as well as sounds." Tyler sneered. "This isn't the Southwest. That's a desert legend." "Legends travel," yelled Emma. "And whatever it is, it's here." I intervened when the debate got out of hand. "Enough. We're heading out. Let's go, and pack up." The trees closed in as we hurried to set up camp. Only the distant snap of branches, far too near for comfort, broke the suffocating quiet. Clutching her arms as if protecting herself from something invisible, Kelly remained beside the RV. Then we heard it. The voice of Tyler. "Hey guys, I discovered something. Come have a look." We stopped. Tyler was standing next to me, his face pale. I grabbed a flashlight and shouted, "Stay here," before moving into the woods. I protested, but Tyler followed. It became darker as we descended further. Then we caught sight of it. A person with its back to us stands between the woods. Tyler was just like that. "Hey!" I yelled. The figure pivoted. Its face, a horrible, distorted parody of Tyler's features. It has excessively big eyes. Its mouth opened out too much. With a guttural, unearthly cry, it charged before we could respond. With our adrenaline rushing, we ran back to camp. "We're leaving now," I yelled. I turned on the engine and everyone climbed inside the RV. We sped down the wooded road once the tires caught after spinning in the loose soil. However, it continued. It raced with us, its limbs jerking in strange ways. Its lips produced unsatisfactory words. "James," it imitated in a twisted voice. "Don't leave." Its claws screeched on the metal as it banged into the side of the RV, causing Emma to scream. The thing fell backwards as Tyler snatched a hatchet from the supplies and swung it furiously at the window, breaking the glass. We continued till we came to a ranger station at the forest's border, trembling and scratched from the broken glass. The ranger gave us a quick glance. He inquired, "Around Alexander Springs?" We gave a nod. He let out a sigh. "You're lucky you made it out." That vacation was never discussed again. After that, Tyler and I grew apart, and Kelly vowed never to camp again. In an attempt to make sense of what we had seen, Emma developed an obsession with the tales. What about me? Since then, I haven't been in the woods. Some locations are wild because something else lives there, not because of the wildlife or the landscape. Something that hungers and waits and watches. My name is Jacob Pfizer. I'm 33 years old, and this happened just a few months ago, though it feels like a lifetime. I've been working as a travel nurse for years, moving from city to city, living in the chaos of hospitals and crowded apartments. When I finally took some time off, I decided to embrace solitude, just me, my RV, and the open road. That's how I ended up in Tate's Hell State Forest in Florida, a place whose name alone should have been a warning. I'd read about the forest's ominous reputation. Online, supposedly it was named after a man saw Tate who wandered the swamp for days under a curse only to emerge near death and mutter, "My name is Tapate, and I've been through hell." Most people dismissed it as folklore, but something about the story intrigued me. It felt like a challenge, a test of my independence and survival skills. I planned to camp there for 3 days, hiking and documenting the experience for my travel blog. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The forest was dense with towering pines and sprawling oaks draped in Spanish moss. The air was thick and humid, buzzing with the constant hum of insects. As I parked my RV at a remote campsite, a park ranger named Mitchell appeared, his orange vest bright against the darkening trees. "You sure you want to stay out here alone?" he asked, his tone friendly but cautious. "Why not?" I replied, trying to sound confident. He shrugged. "It's quiet, that's for sure, but stick to the marked trails. People get lost out here, and some say the swamp doesn't like strangers." I laughed nervously, brushing off his warning. He tipped his hat and left, leaving me alone with the encroaching shadows. As I set up my small campfire, I noticed an older woman standing near the forest entrance. She was watching me intently, her gray hair pulled back in a tight braid. I waved, but she didn't return the gesture. Instead, she called out, her voice carrying an odd weight. "The swamp doesn't forgive the curious," she said, her tone more ominous than I liked. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I told myself she was just a local trying to spook me, but her words lingered as the night deepened. That night the forest was eerily silent. I'd expected the usual symphony of crickets and frogs, but instead there was a suffocating stillness. As I sat by the fire, I heard faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but unmistakably human. I froze, straining my ears. The whispers grew louder, circling the RV, though I couldn't see anything beyond the firelight. Finally I called out, "Hello," as someone near the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the crackle of the fire. My heart raced as I climbed into the RV, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of a long drive and an overactive mind. But when I woke the next morning, muddy handprints covered the windows, large smear prints that didn't look entirely human. The next day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The trails were muddy from an overnight storm, and the dense canopy made it hard to tell what time of day it was. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the forest felt. The air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to shift and ride as though the trees themselves were alive. About an hour, and I found strange wooden symbols hanging from the branches. They looked hand-carved, crude but deliberate: circles, crosses, and spirals strung up with twine. I snapped a few photos for my blog, but a shiver ran down my spine. It felt wrong, like I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. As I turned to head back, I heard laughter, high-pitched and echoing unnaturally. My stomach clenched. I called out, hoping it was other campers, but no one answered. The laughter faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves, as if something was following me. I quickened my pace, refusing to look back. That night the unease turned to outright terror as I sat in the RV trying to ride About the day's hike, the lights began to flicker, then the entire vehicle shook violently as if something massive had slammed into it. I grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open, but there was nothing there, only the dark, silent forest. As I stepped outside, the air grew colder. I swung the flashlight light in every direction, the beam slicing through the darkness. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure stood just beyond the edge of the firelight, tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. Its limbs were too long, its body unnaturally thin, and its head tilted as if studying me. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move, it didn't speak, it simply stood there watching. Then it began to drift toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it. The figure didn't follow, but I could feel its presence lingering just outside. By morning, I was desperate to leave. I packed up quickly, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, and the dashboard lights flickered uselessly. Frustrated, I grabbed my map and decided to hike to the ranger station for help. The forest seemed even more menacing in the daylight. The wooden symbols I had seen the day before were now broken, their pieces scattered across the trail. As I pushed deeper into the swamp, the air grew thicker, choking me with the stench of decay. The whispers returned louder, now surrounding me on all sides. Eventually, I stumbled upon a clearing where a crude grave marker stood, a wooden cross weathered and rotting with a rusted knife embedded in the ground beside it. The whispers grew deafening, swirling around me in an unintelligible chorus. That's when I saw it again. The figure emerged from the shadows, more solid this time. Its face was pale and skeletal, its eyes burning with malevolent light. It raised one spindly arm, pointing directly at me. "I'm sorry," I gasped, though I didn't know what I was apologizing for. The figure tilted its head as if considering my words before letting out a low guttural growl that shook the ground beneath me. Panicked, I grabbed the knife from the grave and held it out like a talisman. The figure recoiled slightly but didn't retreat. In a desperate bid to escape, I dropped the knife and lit a small fire with the matches I kept in my pack. I hurled burning branches toward the figure, and for the first time it retreated, its form dissolving into the shadows. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I ran. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was beginning to rise. The engine miraculously started on the first truck seat, and I tore out of the forest, not stopping until I reached a crowded rest area miles away. I haven't been back to the hell, and I don't plan to. I didn't write about the experience in my blog. Some things are too personal or too terrifying to share, but even now I can't escape the feeling that I didn't leave the forest entirely behind. Last week, I found muddy handprints on my apartment window. I live on the 3rd floor. The night had a stillness that wasn't normal, the kind that made every noise, every creak of the forest feel like it was crawling up your spine. I had been a trucker for 29 years and had seen all kinds of strange things, but nothing prepared me for what happened out there in the Clout National Forest, just past the California-Oregon border. My name's L. Becker. This happened back in October 1994, and to this day, I still can't wrap my head around it. I was hauling a load of construction supplies from Sacramento to Medford. The route took me through dense forest land, and the winding roads were always a challenge, especially after dark. That night I decided to pull off at a remote rest stop about 50 miles from Medford. It was a small tucked-away area with a gravel lot and an old picnic bench surrounded by trees so tall and thick they swallowed the moonlight. I needed a quick break before tackling the last stretch. As I climbed out of the cab, the air was colder than I expected, biting even through my flannel. The forest around me felt oppressive, like the trees were leaning in closer than they should. There wasn't a sound, no crickets, no rustle of leaves, just an eerie silence that felt wrong. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired, and walked over to the bench with my thermos of coffee. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like something rotting, but it grew stronger as the wind shifted. It hit me like a punch to the gut, metallic and sickly sweet. I figured it might be a dead deer nearby, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, but then I saw the marks. The gravel lot stretched into the trees, and right where the light from my truck's headlights started to fade, there were strange drag marks in the dirt. They were wide and deep, like something heavy had been pulled through. Beside them, I noticed what looked like claw marks, long deep gashes that cut through the gravel and into the hard-packed earth. Beneath, I froze, my coffee halfway to my lips. My first thought was a bear, but the space of the claws was wrong, too far apart. Bears didn't drag things like this. The trail led into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. Against every ounce of common sense, I grabbed my flashlight from the truck and followed it. The beam of light wavered as I stepped off the gravel and into the forest. The smell grew stronger, and I had to fight the urge to gag. I moved cautiously, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, but the deeper I went, the softer the ground became, like it had been churned up recently. Then about 50 yards and I found it. A mangled deer lay in a small clearing, its body twisted at an unnatural angle. Its chest was torn open, ribs glistening in the dim light, and its head was missing. I felt a wave of nausea and stepped back, nearly tripping over something behind me. When I turned, my stomach dropped. It was another body, not a deer this time, but a man, or what was left of him. His torso was shredded, and his limbs were bent in ways they shouldn't have been. His face was unrecognizable, but his jacket told me he was probably another trucker, one of those independent guys who worked the same routes. A toolbox lay nearby, the metal stained dark and the lid bent as if someone had stomped on it. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it, a sound that wasn't mine, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves. My flashlight flicked toward the noise, and that's when I saw it. It stood at least 7 feet tall, hunched over, its long arms almost dragging the ground. Its skin was dark and leathery, stretched tight over its ribs, and its head, I can only describe it as something between a lizard and a wolf. Its jaws were elongated, filled with teeth that reminded me of a crocodile's. It stared at me motionless, like it was deciding what to do next. I didn't wait to find out. I bolted back toward my truck, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The thing let out this awful noise, not a growl, but a deep, resonating sound I could feel in my chest. It was coming after me. I could hear its heavy steps crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. I reached the edge of the clearing and spotted my truck through the trees. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. As I reached the gravel lot, I grabbed the tire iron from the side box on the truck. I barely had time to swing around before it was on me. The creature moved fast, faster than anything that size. Shit, it lunged, and I swung the iron with everything I had. The metal connected with a sickening thud, and the thing reeled back, letting out a horrible screech. Its claws lashed out, catching my arm and sending a searing pain through me. Blood dripped down my sleeve, but I didn't let go of the tire iron. I swung again, aiming for its head. This time the blow landed hard, and the creature staggered. It wasn't invincible hurt, but not down. It lunged again, pinning me against the side of the truck. Its breath was hot and foul, and I could feel its claws pressing into my shoulder. I jabbed upward with the iron, catching it under the jaw. The creature howled and released me, staggering back. I scrambled into the cab and grabbed the shotgun I kept under the seat. My hands shook as I loaded it, but I managed to rack a shell just as the thing charged again. I fired, the blast echoing through the forest. The creature collapsed to the ground, twitching but not dead. I didn't take any chances. I fired 2 more shots, each one tearing into its chest, until it stopped moving. I sat there for a moment, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the stench of the creature, my ears ringing from the blasts. When I was sure it wasn't getting up, I climbed out and took a closer look. Its body was a mess of muscle and scales, with patches of fur in odd places. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before, like it didn't belong in this world. My arm throbbed, but I ignored it as I dragged the thing away from the truck. It was heavier than it looked, and my boots slipped on the gravel, but I managed to pull it off the lot and into the trees. I didn't care to keep it around. I climbed back into the cab, my hands slick with blood, and I started the engine and pulled out of that lot, not caring if I left the rest stop a mess. I drove straight through to Medford, not stopping until I saw the city lights. I didn't call the cops. What was I supposed to say? There's no way they would believe me, but I knew what I'd seen the next day. I dropped the load at the site and went straight to a clinic. My name is Luke Guzman Hunter. I'm 48 years old, a retired high school teacher, and a widower. What I'm about to tell you happened just last month during a solo camping trip off Old King Road in Flagler County, Florida. I thought I was looking for peace and quiet, maybe even a little closure. Instead, I found something I still can't explain, something that might still be out there waiting. I arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The drive down Old King Road was scenic but desolate, with tall oaks draped in Spanish moss and palmetto crowding the edges of the narrow dirt road. My RV, a beaten-up 1994 Winnebago, rattled over every bump, but I was used to it. This wasn't my first trip, but something about the stillness unsettled me. I stopped at a convenience store a few miles before the campsite to grab some firewood and snacks. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, looked up from her magazine. As I approached camping out on King Road, she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Yeah," I said. "I heard it's quiet out there, good stargazing." She hesitated. "It's quiet, all right. Just don't wander too far from your RV. And if you hear anything strange, don't go looking for it." I laughed it off, but her words stayed with me as I drove the final stretch to the campsite. The sun was low, and I parked near a pond. The water was dark and still, the air smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. I liked the solitude, at least that's what I told myself. The first sign that something wasn't right came that night. I had a small fire going and the RV's generator was humming softly. I was sitting by the fire nursing a cup of instant coffee when the generator sputtered and died. The sudden silence was jarring. "Damn thing," I muttered, grabbing a flashlight to check it out. Everything looked fine, no loose wires, no obvious problems. When I flipped the switch, it roared back to life as if nothing had happened. I returned to my chair, but the unease lingered. The forest around me felt too quiet, like the wildlife had been holding its breath. Then I heard a faint rustling in the bushes behind me. I turned the flashlight beam, cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Probably a raccoon, I thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The pond looked serene in the daylight, its surface reflecting the gray sky. As I circled it, I noticed something strange: footprints in the mud. They were large, clawed, and definitely not human. A chill ran down my spine. That's when I saw him, a teenage boy, maybe 15 or 16, standing at the edge of the trees. He was thin, with dirty clothes and wild by unkempt hair. His eyes darted nervously as if he didn't want to be seen. "Hey there," I called out. "Are you lost?" The boy flinched, but he didn't run. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. "Do you live out here?" He shook his head. "It's watching you. It watches everyone. You have to leave before it gets dark." Before I could ask more, he turned and bolted into the woods. I considered going after him, but something in his voice, pure raw fear, stopped me. I returned to the RV uneasy. That evening I found a mutilated deer near the edge of the pond. Its body was torn apart, the flesh twisted and shredded as if by massive claws. I've seen animal attacks before, but this was different. It looked deliberate. I decided to stay inside the RV. That night the generator kept cutting out, leaving me in darkness for minutes at a time. Each time the lights flickered back on, I thought I saw movement outside the windows, shadows darting just out of sight. Around midnight, I heard a sound that froze me in place. My late wife's voice. "Gabe," Dana whispered, "come outside." I knew it wasn't real. I've been dreaming of Dana ever since she passed, but this was different. Her voice was so clear, so close. When it called again, I almost opened the door before catching myself. "No," I whispered, backing away. "You're not real." The whisper stopped, but the RV shuddered violently as if something heavy had slammed into it. I grabbed a kitchen knife and held it tight, my heart racing. The shuddering stopped, leaving me in silence. The next morning I found deep scratches on the RV's door like claw marks. The boy Ethan appeared again, standing at a distance. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "It's hungry," he said. "It doesn't stop." "What is it?" I demanded, approaching him. "What's out there?" He hesitated, then muttered, "It's old. It was here before us. It feeds on fear, on grief. If you don't leave, it'll take you." I tried to get him to explain, but he ran off again. This time I followed him. He led me deeper into the woods where the trees grew denser and the air colder. Finally, we reached a clearing with strange symbols carved into the trunks. Ethan pointed at them. "This keeps it out," he said. "Stay here if you want to live." Before I could ask more, he vanished into the trees. I looked around, my pulse hammering. The forest felt alive, the air thick with an oppressive energy. The whispers started again, louder this time, coming from all directions. I returned to the RV, but the hunger followed. That night it showed itself. I was sitting by the fire when the forest went silent. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure at the edge of the trees. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed yellow, fixed on me. "Dana," it said, its voice distorted and hollow. "Come to me." I stood frozen as it stepped closer. The firelight flickered and I saw its face, or what was left of it. The flesh was stretched and rotting, its mouth too wide, filled with jagged teeth. I grabbed a can of lighter fluid and dashed it onto the fire pit, igniting a massive flame. The creature recoiled, letting out an unearthly shriek. I ran toward the symbols Ethan had shown me, the hunger chasing me through the trees. The moment I crossed the boundary of the symbols, the hunger stopped. It paced back and forth, hissing and snarling, but unable to cross. I stayed there until dawn, clutching the knife and listening to its guttural growls. When the sun rose, the hunger vanished. I returned to the RV, packed up, and drove away without looking back. I stopped at Maggie's store on the way out. She took one look at me and nodded. "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. "You're lucky," she said. "Most people don't make it out." Later, I tried to find information about Ethan, but no one had seen a boy matching his description. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth. I had planned to spend 3 days exploring the park, capturing the rushing rapids of the Swanee River and the limestone cliffs that lined its banks. When I arrived, the visitor center was empty except for a ranger named David. He looked up from his desk as I walked in, his face weathered but kind. "Afternoon," he said. "You here for the trails or camping?" "Both," I replied. "I'm a photographer. Thought I'd get some shots of the river." David frowned slightly. "Just be careful around the water. It's beautiful but unpredictable, and don't camp too close to it." "Why not?" I asked, curious. He shrugged. "Currents can be dangerous, and people say strange things happen out there. I've heard about voice kids playing near the river, stuff like that." I chuckled. "Ghost stories. Call it what you want," he said, his tone serious. "But don't ignore the signs. Stay safe." I thanked him and left, dismissing his warnings as part of the park folklore. Still, his words lingered as I drove to the campsite. I set up my RV near a clearing, a short walk from the Swanee River. The late afternoon sun glinted off the water, and the sound of the rushing rapids was hypnotic. I spent the first few hours walking along the trails, snapping shots of the limestone bluffs and the towering cypress trees. The place was stunning. Things took a turn that evening when my drone malfunctioned. I had been flying it over the river to capture aerial shots when it suddenly veered off course and crashed into the trees. Muttering curses, I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the woods to retrieve it. The forest was darker than I had expected, the dense sea canopy swallowing the light. I found the drone near the riverbank, but as I bent to pick it up, I noticed something strange. Small handprints in the mud, like those of children. They were fresh too, leading toward the water. I scanned the area with my flashlight. "Hello, is someone there?" No answer. The only sound was the rushing water. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I Shook it off, kids must have been playing here earlier, I told myself. Still, I hurried back to my RV uneasy. That night, as I reviewed the photos on my laptop, I noticed something odd. In one of the shots of the river, there were faint figures in the background, small pale shapes that resembled children. I zoomed in, but the resolution wasn't clear enough to make out details. It's just a trick of the light, I thought, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of laughter. Was faint, distant, but unmistakably that of children. Groggy, I peered out the RV's window, but saw nothing except the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the river. The laughter came again, closer this time. My chest tightened as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. Hello, who's out there? The laughter stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood frozen, my flashlight beam scanning the tree line. Finally, I retreated to the RV and locked the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I decided to shake off the weirdness and focus on my work. I hiked along the trails, capturing the beauty of the park, but the unease grew. The forest seemed quieter than it should be. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps. As I neared the river, I saw a boy standing on the opposite bank. He looked about 8 years old, with pale skin and clothes that seemed out of place, like something from the 19th century. He didn't move, just stared at me. Hey, I called out, are you okay? Where are your parents? The boy raised his hand and pointed downstream. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to follow him, but something about the way he moved, silent and smooth, like he wasn't quite real, kept me rooted to the spot. That night the sounds returned. Laughter, splashing, and faint voices echoed through the forest. At one point, I heard a girl's voice calling my name. Jacob. She whispered, come play with us. My blood turned cold. I checked the windows, but the outside was dark. Then I heard footsteps, tiny pattering steps circling the RV, heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by a low rushing sound like wind through the trees, but the air was still. Then I saw them, 3 children standing near the edge of the clearing, their eyes hollow and their skin pale and translucent. They didn't speak, just stared, their heads tilted slightly as if curious. One of them, a girl with long tangled hair, took a step toward me. Panicking, I slammed the door shut and locked it. The children vanished, but the sound of their laughter echoed in my ears long after they were gone. By the next day, I was ready to leave, but when I turned the key in the RV's ignition, nothing happened. The battery was dead. Frustrated, I grabbed my camera and decided to take one last walk to the river before finding help. When I reached the bank, the children were waiting for me. This time they were closer, their forms more solid. The boy from before stepped forward. Why are you here? He asked, his voice soft but firm. I'm taking photos, I stammered. I didn't mean to disturb anything. You're in our place, the girl said, her hollow eyes boring into mine. Stay with us. I shook my head. I can't. The children exchanged looks, then reached out their hands. The air around me grew colder and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. I stumbled back, my heart racing. You can't leave, the boy said. No one leaves. Desperate, I pulled out my camera. Look, I said, showing them a photo of the river with their faint silhouettes. You're here, people will know your story. You won't be forgotten. The children hesitated. The cold air eased slightly and their forms flickered as if caught between this world and the next. Promise, the girl whispered. I promise, I said, my voice trembling. The children faded, their laughter echoing softly. As they disappeared, the forest grew quiet again, but the air felt lighter, less oppressive. When I returned to the RV, the engine started on the first try. I didn't question it, I just drove back. At the visitor center, I told David what had happened. He listened, his face grave, but didn't say much. As I left, he muttered, you're lucky they let you go. My name is Julian Norris. I'm 39 years old, and this happened a few months ago when I decided to take a break from the life I've been barely holding together. My wife Jenna passed away last year, and the silence of my empty home had become unbearable. I'd always loved music, it's what I taught for years, but after she died I couldn't bring myself to pick up a guitar, so I bought an RV. and decided to travel hoping to find anything that would help me feel alive again. That's how I ended up at Big Shea State Park in Florida. I'd read about the park rapids, the largest in the state, and thought their roaring, chaotic beauty might inspire me to compose again. What I didn't know was that the silence I've been running from would find me there in the voices of the dead. I pulled into the park just before dusk. The forest was dense and quiet, save for the distant roar of the rapids. The ranger station was empty, but I found a map pinned to the bulletin board outside. It marked a few trails and campsites, one of which was near the riverbank. That's where I decided to stay. As I set up my RV, a ranger approached a woman in her 30s wearing the usual khaki uniform and a wide-brimmed hat. Her name tag read Laura. Camping alone? She asked, her tone polite but laced with concern. Yeah, I said, trying to sound casual. Just needed some peace and quiet. Laura nodded but hesitated. The rapids can be unpredictable. Be careful if you hike near the water. She paused, glancing toward the tree line. Some people say you can hear voices out there at night, probably just the water playing tricks, but it can be unsettling if you're not used to it. I smiled, more amused than unnerved. Thanks for the warning. Laura didn't return the smile. Just don't wander too far with that. She left, her words hanging in the cool evening air. After dinner, I sat outside the RV with my guitar, strumming idly as the last light faded from the sky. The sound of the rapids was louder now, a constant rush that drowned out the usual nighttime symphony of crickets and frogs. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of inspiration. Maybe this trip wasn't such a bad idea. Then I heard a faint giggle, like a child's, carried on the wind. I froze, my fingers stilling on the strings. It was faint, almost drowned out by the river, but unmistakable. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there. Hello, I called, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No answer, just the river and the faint rustle of leaves. I told myself it was nothing, just an echo or my imagination playing tricks, and went inside to sleep. That night I dreamed of Jenna. She was standing by the river, her back to me, humming the lullaby she used to sing when we were younger. I tried to call out to her, but no sound came from my lips. When I woke, my cheeks were wet with tears. The next morning I decided to hike one of the trails that wound along the river. The air was crisp and the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden streaks, but the unease from the night before lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway down the trail, I noticed something odd, small footprints in the mud, too small to belong to an adult. They ran alongside my own for a few steps before veering off toward the river. There were no other campers around, and the sight sent a chill down my spine. As I followed the trail, the roar of the rapids grew louder, almost deafening. Then I heard it again, a child's laughter, clearing and sharp, cutting through the noise. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. Who's there? I again. No answer. Shaking my head, I pressed on, determined to reach the riverbank. When I got there, I found something even stranger, a small moss-covered doll lying on the rocks. Its face was faded and weathered, but its eyes seemed to glint in the sunlight, almost as if they were watching me. I picked it up, examining it closely. As I turned it over, a faint melody began to play, a music box tune, soft and haunting. My breath caught in my throat. The tune was the same lay Jenna used to hum that evening. I couldn't shake the melody from my head. It felt like the forest was closing and the shadows growing longer, the air heavier. As I sat in the RV, the music box tune began to play again, faint at first, then louder. I searched the RV, convinced I'd accidentally brought the doll inside, but it wasn't there. The tune stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft knock at the door. I froze, my hands trembled as I reached for the handle and yanked the door open. No one was there, just the empty forest bathed in moonlight. Then I saw them, shadows flitting between the trees. They were small, childlike, moving too quickly to be human. My stomach churned as I realized they were circling the RV. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The RV began to shake as if something or many somethings were pounding on the sides. I shouted for them to stop, but the noise only grew louder, the whispers and laughter blending into a chaotic cacophony. Finally I grabbed my guitar and strummed the first chords that came to mind, playing louder and louder until the shaking stopped, the laughter faded, leaving only the sound of my music and the distant roar of the rapids. The next morning I knew I had to leave, but something drew me back to the river. I followed to the trail again, clutching the doll I'd found. The voices were louder now, calling my name, singing the lullaby in eerie childlike tones. When I reached the riverbank, the air grew icy and the shadows beneath the trees seemed to ripple like water. "I know you're here," I said, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The voices grew louder and the shadows took shape. 3 children, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark voids. They stared at me, their expressions a mix of sadness and anger. "Helpless," they whispered, their voices overlapping in a haunting harmony. "What do you need?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. They pointed to the doll, and in that moment, I understood they were tied to it. Bound to the river by whatever tragedy had claimed them. I placed the doll on the ground and stepped back, watching as the children reached for it. But as their hands touched it, their forms began to twist and contort, their whispers turning to wails. The river surged, the rapids crashing violently, and the shadows rushed toward me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the rocks, and ran as fast as I could, the screams echoing in my ears. I left Big Shades that day, vowing never to return. The doll stayed by the river. My name is Logan Carter, and I'm 34 years old. What I'm about to tell you isn't some tall tale for clicks or likes, it's the truth, even if I can't prove it. This happened in the summer of last year, deep in the heart of Hockock Swamp, Massachusetts, a place some people call the heart of the Bridgewater Triangle. I went in as a skeptic, thinking I'd spend a week documenting my survivalist skills for my blog. I came out broken, both physically and mentally, and I'm still not sure if I escaped it all. It started with an idea I'd had for months: test my skills by surviving 7 days alone in one of the most notoriously haunted places in the country. I didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. I thought the stories were just folklore blown out of proportion. So I packed my gear: tent, GPS, water purifier, knives, and my GoPro, and drove to the edge of the swamp. The first thing you notice in Hockock Swamp is the silence. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just the occasional drip of water and the squelch of mud underfoot. It was oppressive, but I chalked it up to the swamp's natural atmosphere. By late afternoon, I found a clearing to set up camp. As I hammered stakes into the soggy ground, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but there was nothing but dense trees and mist. "Get a grip," I muttered, shaking off the unease. That night I built a small fire and recorded my first blog entry. I talked about the swamp's history, how the Wampanoag people believed it was a place of great spiritual power, and how locals whispered about strange lights and creatures. As I spoke, the words felt heavier than I expected, like they carried a weight I didn't understand. I fell asleep to the crackling of the fire. When I woke up, the fire was out and something fell off. As I stepped outside the tent, I froze. Bare footprints surrounded my campsite. They were human-like, but too large, with long claw-like toes. "Maybe a prank," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. Who would trek this far into the swamp just to mess with me, and why wouldn't I have heard them? I brushed it off, deciding to explore further into the swamp. My GPS flickered in and out, forcing me to rely on a map. Around midday, I stumbled upon something bizarre: a crude shrine made of animal bones and sticks perched on a stone slab. The air around it was colder, almost suffocating. I took a few photos and moved on quickly, feeling an inexplicable dread. That night, as I edited footage by the fire, I noticed my knife was missing. I searched the tent, my backpack, nothing. Finally, I found it stuck in a nearby tree blade first, as though it had been thrown with precision. My stomach churned. I didn't sleep well. On the third day, my water purifier broke. I cursed under my breath, knowing I'd have to boil water from now on, which would cost me precious time and energy. The swamp seemed to mock me, its stillness amplified by my rising frustration. That night the whispers began. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I lay in my tent, the Sounds became distinct, my name spoken softly over and over. Logan, Logan, help me. It sounded like my ex-girlfriend's voice, fragile and pleading. My rational mind told me it was a trick of isolation, a manifestation of guilt. But when I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the whispers moved, retreating into the darkness. I didn't follow. On the fourth day, I stumbled upon the shrine again, or at least I thought it was the same one this time. The bones were arranged differently and symbols were carved into the trees around it. What the hell, I muttered, taking a step back. That's when I saw a figure in the distance, crouched low to the ground. It was humanoid, but distorted, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, just watched me. I don't remember running back to camp, but I must have. By the fifth day, I was a mess. My gear felt like a hindrance more than a help. And I was down to my last energy bar. The whispers had grown louder at night, and my maps didn't seem to align with the terrain anymore. I was lost that evening as I boiled water over a dwindling fire. I heard a branch snap. I turned and saw it, the figure from before, now closer. Its face, it was my face, but wrong, stretched and twisted. Leave me alone, I shouted, throwing a rock at it. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it mimicked my voice. Leave me alone. I backed into the, clutching my knife like a lifeline. Desperation clawed at me. On the sixth day, I tried to retrace my steps to the edge of the swamp, but every path seemed to loop back to the shrine. I felt trapped, like the swamp itself was conspiring against me. That night, the entity grew bolder. It slashed at my tent, tearing through the fabric like paper. I scrambled out, swinging my knife wildly, but the creature danced just out of reach. It was toying with me. On the final day, I decided I had nothing to lose. I gathered dry branches and doused the shrine in lighter fluid. As the flames roared to life, the swamp seemed to shudder. The entity appeared again, screaming, not a human scream, but a guttural, animalistic roar. It charged at me, its claws slicing across my arm. As I stumbled backward, I swung my knife blindly, connecting with something solid. The creature shrieked and disappeared into the shadows. I ran. When I finally emerged from the swamp, I collapsed into the arms of a search and rescue team. I'd missed my check-in by 3 days, and they'd been combing the area. They didn't believe me about the creature. My footage was corrupted, and the photos I'd taken of the shrine were blurred beyond recognition. But sometimes late at night, I hear it, the whisper my name. The swamp didn't let me go. It just gave me a head start. I thought it was just another quiet shift. But that night in Crooked Pine National Forest, I learned silence is where terror hides. My name is Grayson Morris, and I'm 41 years old. This happened in late October during a weekend camping trip to Falling Water State Park in Florida. I was there with my wife Linda, our 10-year-old daughter Sarah, and our 7-year-old son Joey. What started as an ordinary family trip turned into something I'll never forget. Though sometimes I wish I could. We had planned the trip as a way to disconnect from screens and reconnect as a family. I wanted to teach my kids a bit about survival skills, maybe show them how to start a fire or identify edible plants. Linda was on board, even though she had her reservations about the old RV. I insisted on driving. It had its quirks, flickering lights, and an engine that sometimes took a few tries to start, but I was confident it would get us through. When we arrived at Falling Water State Park, the sun was just beginning to set. The golden light filtered through the tall pine trees, and the sound of distant bird song filled the air. The kids were already squabbling over who got which bunk bed in the RV, and Linda sighed as she unpacked a cooler full of sandwiches and snacks. This is going to be good for us, I said, giving her a reassuring smile. Fresh air, family bonding, it's what we need. She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the dense woods surrounding our campsite. Sure, as long as nothing breaks down. That evening we gathered around a small fire I built. Joey poked at the flames with a stick, and Sarah was off to the side scribbling in a notebook she brought along For stories, she had a vivid imagination, always making up tales about fairies and witches. Linda read a book, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the fur light. "What are you writing about, kiddo?" I asked Sarah. She looked up and smiled. "A friend I met today." My heart sank for a moment, thinking she might have wandered off and spoken to a stranger. "What friend?" "Ellie," she said matter-of-factly. "She lives by the waterfall." I exchanged a glance with Linda. "You didn't go off alone, did you?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I didn't meet her in person. She just started talking to me when we got here." Linda frowned. "Honey, it's okay to have an imaginary friend, but don't scare your dad like that." Sarah's expression darkened. "She's not imaginary. I didn't push it. Kids have wild imaginations, and I figured it was just part of her storytelling hobby." The first truly strange thing happened later that night. I was outside stoking the fire one last time before bed when I heard faint laughter coming from the woods. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I stood still, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. "Kids," I called, but they were already inside the RV with Linda. The laughter faded, and I told myself it was probably another camper. Still, it put me on edge. The next morning, Linda complained about a cold draft in the RV. "It's like someone left the door open," she said, pulling her cardigan tighter. I checked the door and the windows. Everything was locked up tight. We spent the day hiking to the park's main attraction, the waterfall. Sarah was unusually quiet, lagging behind and glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. Joey, on the other hand, was full of energy, running ahead and shouting, "Come on, slowpokes." The trail led us to the waterfall, a beautiful cascade of water tumbling into a deep sinkhole. As we admired the view, Sarah tugged on my sleeve. "Ellie says this is where it happened," she whispered. "Where? What happened?" I asked, my voice low. Sarah didn't answer. She just stared at the water. That night the strangeness grew worse. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of faint knocking on the RV door. My first thought was that it was Joey playing a prank, but when I checked, both kids were asleep in their bunks. The knocking came again, this time from the back of the RV. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold night air. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone around except for a single pair of child-sized muddy prints leading toward the woods. The next morning, Sarah seemed withdrawn and Joey complained about bad dreams. Linda pulled me aside. "Something's not right here, Grayson," she said. "The kids aren't acting like themselves." I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too, a heaviness in the air, a sense that we weren't alone. By the third day, things reached a breaking point. Sarah began talking to Ellie out loud, carrying on conversations as if the girl were standing right beside her. When Linda tried to intervene, Sarah shouted, "You're scaring her. She doesn't like it when you yell." That night I woke to the sound of the RV door creaking open. Sarah was gone. Panic surged through me as I grabbed a flashlight and followed her tiny footprints into the woods. I found her standing by the waterfall, her arms outstretched as if reaching for something. A faint figure stood in front of her, a young girl soaking wet, her hair hanging in tangled strands over her pale face. "Sarah," I shouted. The figure turned toward me, and I froze. Her eyes were hollow black pits, and her mouth twisted into a scream that echoed through the woods. Linda arrived moments later, clutching Joey's hand. Together we pulled Sarah away from the water. The ghost didn't follow, but her presence lingered, oppressive and cold, back in the RV. We tried to make sense of what was happening. Sarah, still dazed, murmured, "She's so lonely. She just wants someone to stay with her." I remember the muddy footprints, the laughter, the feeling of being watched. "She's dangerous," I said. "We need to leave now." But the RV wouldn't start. The lights flickered and the air grew colder. A loud bang came from the roof, followed by the sound of scraping metal. Linda clutched my arm. "What does she want?" "She wants Sarah," I said, my voice trembling. Linda suggested offering Ellie something to appease her. Sarah hesitated, then handed over a doll she'd brought along. "Ellie can have this," she said, "so she won't be lonely anymore." We left the doll at the base of the waterfall, whispering a prayer for Ellie to find peace. For Moment the woods fell silent and I thought it was over as we drove away, the RV finally roaring to life. I glanced in the rearview mirror for a split second. I thought I saw Ellie standing at the edge of the woods clutching the doll, then she was gone. The kids were quieter on the ride home and Linda seemed lost and thought we didn't talk about what happened, not right away, but every now and then I catch Sarah staring out the window, as if listening to someone I can't hear. My name is Emily Knight and I'm 31 years old. What I'm about to share happened just 2 months ago during a camping trip in Tate's Hell State Forest in Florida. I used to laugh at ghost stories and legends. Now I'm not so sure it was my idea to go. I'd read about the forest's creepy history, stories of people vanishing, strange curses, and the infamous final words of C.B. Tate. My name is C.B. Tate, and I've been to hell. It seemed perfect for an adventurous weekend with my closest friends. There were 4 of us. Danny, my best friend since high school, level-headed and sarcastic at 30. Melissa, quiet and jumpy but sweet, tagged along reluctantly. And Cody, a guy I'd known for years but never fully trusted. He was brash, competitive, and had a habit of stirring up trouble. I suspected he had a crush on me, which only made things awkward. We took my RV, an old but functional beast, and parked it deep in the forest. The swampy smell of the air and the dense canopy of twisted trees added to the eerie vibe. Perfect, I thought. We set up near a clearing surrounded by cypress trees. Danny got the fire going and Melissa unpacked supplies while Cody cracked jokes about the forest named Tate's Hell. He said with a smirk, probably just an old drunk who got lost and died. Yeah, Danny shot back, so maybe keep your jokes down, Cody. Don't want to piss off the ghosts. Melissa shivered and muttered, can we not talk about ghosts? I laughed, trying to ease the tension. Relax, guys. It's just a forest. What's the worst that could happen? That night, the first sign of something wrong came when the generator started acting up. We had just finished eating when the RV's lights flickered and then went out. The only light came from the fire, casting long dancing shadows across the trees. I'll check it, Danny said, grabbing a flashlight. He came back a few minutes later looking puzzled. Everything's fine with the generator, it just stopped. I don't get it, Cody snorted. Probably a squirrel chewed a wire, no big deal. But I noticed Melissa staring into the trees, clutching her jacket. Did you guys hear that? She whispered. Hear what? I asked. It sounded like whispering, like someone saying my name. We all went quiet. I didn't hear anything, but the air felt heavier, but like the forest was holding its breath. The next day we decided to hike a nearby trail. I brought an old map I found online, but it quickly became clear it was outdated. Trails branched off in confusing directions and landmarks didn't match up. We wandered for hours before stumbling across something unsettling. It was a small clearing with a crude shrine made of sticks and bones. Animal skulls hung from the trees and strange symbols were carved into the dirt. Melissa refused to go near it. Probably just a hunter's prank, Cody said, poking at the bones with a stick. Don't touch it, Melissa snapped, surprising everyone. It's not a prank. This feels wrong. I told Cody to leave it alone and we moved on, but the tension was thick and even Danny looked uneasy. Back at camp, the generator failed again. The map I left on the picnic table was gone, as if the wind had taken it, but the air was still. That night the whispering started. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it clearly. Someone saying my name, faint but unmistakable. Danny, I hissed, shaking his arm. Did you hear that? Hear what? He said groggily. Before I could answer we heard it again, a high-pitched scream far away but chilling. Melissa started crying. It's just an animal, Cody said, though his voice shook. But it wasn't just an animal, I was sure of it. The next morning Melissa refused to leave the RV. She said she'd seen something in the woods the night before, a pale woman with hollow eyes watching us from the shadows. You were dreaming, Cody said dismissively. You've been spooked since we got here. No, Melissa said firmly. I wasn't dreaming, she was real. I wanted to believe Cody was right, but the way Melissa said it sent a shiver down my spine. Still, we decided to stay. I didn't want to give up on the trip because of some creepy noises that evening Melissa vanished. We were sitting by the fire when she suddenly stood up and walked toward the swamp. "I'll be back," she said, her voice flat. "Melissa," I called after her. She didn't turn around. "Danny," and I followed her flashlight beam, but it stopped abruptly near the edge of the swamp. The mud was churned up and her shoe lay half buried. There was no sign of her. Panic set and we shouted her name, but the only response was the croaking of frogs and the rustle of leaves. Then Danny found the altar. It was larger than the one we'd seen before, surrounded by bones and rotting wood. Symbols were etched into the mud, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The air of decay. "This is wrong," Danny said. "We have to leave now." As we made our way back to the RV, the forest came alive. Shadows darted between the trees, and the whispers turned into voices, mocking, taunting, calling our names. Then we saw her, the witch. She was pale, gaunt, with stringy black hair and hollow eyes that burned with hatred. She stood motionless, watching us, her bony hands outstretched. Cody froze, staring at her in terror. "What the hell is that?" he whispered before anyone could answer. The witch let out an ear-piercing scream. The ground beneath us seemed to ripple, and spectral hands reached from the swamp, clawing at our legs. We ran for the RV, but the witch followed. Her twisted form appeared in every shadow, her whispers filling our ears. When we reached the clearing, we found the RV surrounded by grotesque humanoid figures with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. They clawed at the windows, hissing and growling. Danny grabbed a can of lighter fluid and a lighter. "The altar," he said. "We have to destroy it." We ran back to the altar, dodging the figures that seemed to materialize from the swamp. Danny doused the wooden effigies with fluid and lit them on fire. The flames roared to life, and the witch screamed in rage. Her form flickered like a dying candle. But as the altar burned, Cody was dragged into the swamp. He screamed for help, but the spectral hands pulled him under. Then he was gone. The witch vanished, and the forest fell silent. Danny and I stumbled back to the RV, shaking and covered in mud. The generator worked again, and the lights flickered back on. When we reached the ranger station the next day, we reported everything. They didn't believe us, but promised to search for Melissa and Cody.